Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at the basics of web development and networking. And specifically, we are going to take a look at the concept of a uniform resource locator. Now, you probably know them more commonly as URLs. You've probably thrown the word around or the term around quite a bit without really knowing or breaking down what it means. This video, we're going to take a look at various parts of a URL and also look at some examples. So to begin with, let's take a look at some terminology here. So first of all, we're going to start off with the Uniform Resource Locator, or URL. And what is it? Well, it simply specifies the address and mechanism for the retrieval of a network resource. What that is that's a fancy way of saying that it tells your application what protocol to use and where to go to get some resource. It might be data, it might be a web page. As it turns out, it may actually be other types of content. We're going to focus mainly on web content. In other words, we're going to focus mainly on the stuff as it relates to HTTP, HTTPS, and a little bit of FTP. However, as it turns out, you are not, in fact, limited to that. And what we want to do is we want to take a look sort of as generic view of a URL. Before we go any further, we do want to talk about a couple of other terms that you may have already heard and sort of mixed in and possibly even confused, and that is the idea of a URI, or a Uniform Resource Identifier. The idea is that it is a unique sequence of characters then that identifies some sort of resource. Now, the important thing to note here, and the reason why I want to emphasize that and also the URN, or the Uniform Resource Name, is that the intention is within a given namespace or within a given domain that they are supposed to be unique. What do I mean by that? Well, let's go to the URN, or the Uniform Resource Name, and let's start with that to appreciate what's actually going on. So the idea is that it's supposed to be a globally unique persistent identifier, and you can think of that as perhaps something like a UPC code or the ISBN number off of a book. But the idea is that globally, in other words, within all of the bookstores and with all of the businesses that use a UPC code, that effectively there is only one UPC code per unique product. And ideally then that there is one unique product for each UPC code. And the idea there is that you don't end up having a confusion when you walk up to the register and you scan that UPC code for the product. In other words, you can uniquely identify the product. Same is true with the ISBN number. It's an attempt to standardize the book IDs so that there's not different IDs for different systems and different IDs, for instance, for different libraries or different stores. Now, that is only partially necessary. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is, imagine then if you had a small business where, in addition to the ISBN number or even the UPC code, that you also wanted to have your own locally internally used identifiers. In other words, maybe you only sold 1,000 products. You didn't want to go through the overhead of setting up a system that would use the UPC system or even the ISBN number. And the idea is that you still want to keep track of your inventory and you have 1,000 unique products. Well, quite simply, you may just simply use a combination of the name of the product and some number, or for that matter, you may just use the numbers from 1 to 1,000. They are not globally unique. In other words, there's probably another business somewhere else on the other side of the world that leverages the exact same concept. In other words, they too may have another set of products different from yours that use the numbers from 1 to 1,000. However, essentially, given the likelihood that the two businesses on opposite sides of the world would ever interact, then effectively they are unique within their own domain or within their own namespace. Now, essentially, that gives you the idea behind the Uniform Resource Name, and then we could take that a step farther and look at the idea then behind a Uniform Resource Identifier as well as a uniform resource locator. So specifically with the URI, then the unique sequence of characters only has to be unique given the scope of the network. Now, if we were on the internet, in other words, the World Wide Web, then it would have to be globally unique. But as it turns out, if you are working with an intranet, in other words, something that's private that you wouldn't necessarily get out to the rest of the world, maybe, for instance, you have a company-owned help desk or something along those lines, well, it turns out that you can, in fact, have an identifier that is scoped just for that particular intranet domain. Now, again, I'm not going to go too far into those, but I do want you to understand the differences between the URL and the URI and the URN, and then also to point out that the distinction between the URN and the URL has sort of diminished, and they are simply using then the idea of this URI. Again, we have the Internet Engineering Task Force that manages the technical standards associated with the URLs, URIs, and URNs. So let's take a look at the components of a URL. We'll take a look at a couple of examples in just a minute as well. But the idea is that it's broken down into multiple parts. The first part being the protocol, which simply identifies to the application what the communication mechanism or type will be. Now, again, since we're going to be focusing mainly on web development, we're going to focus primarily on the HTTP and HTTPS protocol and a little bit with the FTP protocol. However, there are others. And so you probably already noticed this behavior, but you didn't recognize it. And that is that if you were to simply go to your web browser and type in the address of your favorite social media site or news site, for instance, something like www.cnn.com, well, you don't explicitly type in the HTTP or the HTTPS. And as it turns out, most of the browsers will simply prepend at this point the HTTPS because it's assumed then that is going to be operating under secure HTTP. Now, again, you've got some control over this, particularly in Chrome. You can control the behavior, but fundamentally, the protocol, for instance, in this case, HTTP or HTTPS, is part of that URL. It just so happens that we don't commonly use it. The next portion of the URL is the domain. And the example that I gave with the www.cnn.com, well, that's just simply that multi-part name that indicates the specific resource that you're trying to get access to. Same is true with www.facebook.com, as well as other resources. Now, the idea is that this can be used in conjunction with DNS to be able to route you to the specific resource you are looking for. But that multi-part name can be a 2, 3, and even a 4-part domain name that can then be used to identify the specific resource. And more importantly, again, it must be unique within the network scope. In other words, if you're on the internet, well, it needs to be globally unique. And if you are on a private intranet, it's okay if you have the same name for different private networks. You go back to the example where I was talking about the two small business owners being on completely opposite sides of the world and never interacting with each other. There will never be confusion between what is a particular product, let's say an ID of 550, and another product in another store with that same ID. Again, that is for intranet only, but I want you to be familiar with the concept of how it relates then to networking. The next piece is going to be the port, and we won't talk too much about the port in this specific video. We'll see how it is going to be used in later videos, but fundamentally then it helps to further refine the URL in that it is a specific numeric address that indicates a service endpoint, a resource on the server. Most commonly, what you will see is going to be port 80 and port 443, port 80 corresponding to HTTP, and port 443 for HTTPS. Again, that's not something that you're going to usually end up typing. We will see in just a second a specific example where we're using a non-standard port, but yes, they are in fact part of the URL. The next portion is going to be a little bit more vague and a little harder to define, but that is the path to the particular resource on the server. Now, again, we start off with a protocol that tells you how we want to interact. The domain, you can think of it as physically or possibly virtually, but a resource such as a server. The port tells you where on that server or a particular service endpoint may be, and then the path then will give you access to a specific resource. Now, it is not universally related to the file system, but it is a good idea, at least to start off with, to think of this in terms of a file system or a taxonomy tree. In other words, again, the idea here is that this is further refining the path to a specific resource. Now, continuing on with this concept, then we have a couple of optional fields here, the query string and the fragment. The query string then simply allows for you to pass specified parameters to the server. If you go back to the example where we were talking about that small business that maybe had an inventory of with products from ID from 1 to 1,000, let's say you were interested in just simply pulling up the product associated with ID equal to 100. And that's sort of where we're going with this. You can imagine that you're trying to search then the inventory for this small business. Perhaps they went ahead and set up a intranet server to be able to do their inventory management. And you would simply then pass a query string using the ID equal to 100. And then continuing with that theme, then we would also have the use of a fragment, perhaps for the description of the product associated with that ID. The fragment is just nothing more than a string of characters that points to a specific portion on that particular resource. You can oftentimes think of it as somewhat of an anchor point on a web page. We'll see in just a second what I am referring to with that. So continuing on, then let's actually look at what happens when you put all of those pieces together. And you can see here that what I've got is this generic URL. By the way, if you click on this, this won't work because this is just something that I have put together. We could, of course, go ahead and set this up to work. That would not be a big problem. But you can see here that the first portion of it is the protocol. In this case, I'm just simply using HTTP, not HTTPS. In other words, we do not have a secure web server. You can see the domain there of www.mywebstore.com. I just realized there was a typo in this that I will fix before I post this. But we have then the port 80, and then the path of the inventory, and then to the search.php, which is PHP script that then will allow for an argument to be passed. In this case, the query string of ID equal to 100. You'll notice a couple of things there. The question mark indicates the beginning of the query string. The individual portions of the query string are separated by ampersands. We'll see that in just a second. And then we have the pound sign followed by the description, which means that I'm essentially looking at that particular location on the page. The idea, for instance, is you can imagine that I'm going to pull up the web page associated with the ID equal to 100, and I'm going to navigate to the description of that particular product. So, practically speaking, you're not likely to encounter all of these pieces at once. It's not that it's not possible to do it. It's just that usually a site uses one approach or another, or maybe a couple of approaches, not necessarily all of them. Again, there's no reason that they couldn't. So to start off with, you can probably go ahead and pause this video and just take a second to look at the URL associated with this YouTube video. Depending on how you've clicked on it, you probably are looking at my playlist. And if you notice, there's a question mark after the playlist that then allows for you to pass the list ID. That list ID is unique to my channel. And the idea is that that would then show you all of the videos in a particular playlist. You'll also notice that you can, if you click on a specific video, in addition to getting my channel name, you will also get the video ID. And you can notice that that is then again simply separated by an ampersand. You'll notice here with the Wikipedia article, it's a little bit simpler. We just go to the landing page of en.wikipedia.org, and you can see here that I provided you with a couple of links here. The second one is, of course, the link to the HTTP protocol. The third one shows you how you can use that fragment. And this is, again, why I sort of refer to this as an anchor point. In other words, if you click on the third link, it'll take you to the summary of the HTTP milestones. In other words, the versions of HTTP. In other words, you will go to the page and then immediately be navigated down to that fragment or to that portion or that subsection of the page. Now, a couple of other examples to take a look at. You could sort of see how different companies, different sites do different approaches. We'll go with DigiKey here. This happens to be the URL for a 200 ohm resistor. You'll notice that you have the protocol of HTTPS, the domain of www.digikey.com, and then the path indicating, in this case, the language for EN, that you're wanting to look at the products, a specific product, the detail associated with a specific product. And you'll notice that they have went so far as to include the company name in the path as well, the Stackpole Electronics Incorporated, and then the ID associated with that particular product. Now, if you dig a little bit deeper into the DigiKey site, you'll actually notice that they use both a unique identifier for their product within the scope of their own company, but they also use a more globally unique identifier as well. Again, that just sort of goes back to the concept that we were talking about with the idea of the URN and the URI, the name and the identifier. Now, continuing on, you'll see here another example. In this case, I have pulled up the eBay site associated with the Suzuki vehicles. You'll see a couple of things going on here. First of all, there is the protocol as well as the domain for ebay.com. The path is kind of short, but then you'll notice that it is immediately followed by a series of pieces in the query string. And you'll see here that basically what you've got is a number of terms that are and values that are being passed. This is something a little more internal to them. The 6001 tells them the type of product that you're searching for. The make value, I think you can guess, is the brand. And you can see here that the item condition, again, is some sort of internal value that determines whether it's new, used, etc. And you can see here again, each one of those parts of the query string are separated by an ampersand. If you were to click on this link, you would simply get all of the results for a Suzuki vehicle in the neighborhood or in the region of 35294. Now, looking at another example and sort of a hybrid of those, if you would, is the way that Google Maps works. You could see that in addition to, again, the protocol and the domain, that they use a path that involves not only the maps portion of the path, but also the GPS coordinates, and they go ahead and pass a query string. And again, this will just give you then the location of a map centered around that GPS coordinate. Now, for a little bit of variety, I thought I would take a slightly simpler example, and if anything, tie this back to one of our earlier videos in that we were talking about the DNS or the domain name system and how you would resolve that friendly name of a URL to an IP address. And you can see that once again, we've simply gone back to the www.uab.edu. And specifically, I'm looking at the path for the home page. Now, what I've done here is I've simply opened up a console. I've pinged www.uab.edu, and I've gotten the IP address. And you'll notice if you click on either of those links, assuming that the IP address hasn't changed by the time you watch this video and look at this PowerPoint, that you can access the same site using that friendly name, that friendly domain name, or the IP address, as well as the path associated with a particular resource on that server. Now, again, there can be some things going on with a particular site, but typically speaking, once you have the domain name and you have the resource associated with that domain name, then you can also navigate to it using the IP address. Now, the last example I want to give you is a development example or developer example. And you'll see here that I have a local host, which is nothing more than 127.0.0.1. But I also specify using the colon notation, the port. In other words, what I'm doing here is I'm developing a website on my local computer, and I'm using Visual Studio in debug mode for an ASP.NET application. Again, the details of that don't really matter too much, but fundamentally, what you can do then is you can simply launch a web server on your local machine. And what it does is to make sure that, for a number of reasons, that you don't have any issues with debugging the site, particularly if you're already running a production site. Well, it just simply picks a random port from a series of available ports. In this case, for this particular instance, it was 7,937. And again, if you click on these links, they won't work unless you just so happen to have a web server already set up on your computer with that specific port. Now, usually, and what we will actually see in a later video, is that we will use the Apache web server, and we can simply test an Apache website using the localhost :80, which is the commonly used port number for HTTP, but you can also access it using 127.0.0.1 and that port number. Now, again, here I noticed some minor typo that does not really matter. I've forgotten the trailing slash. This will route you to the page no matter what. But again, you won't have access to this particular web server unless you have set one up at this particular address. Big advantage with the local host to the 127.0.0.1 means that it simply can't be accessed publicly or externally from your development machine. So hopefully you found this video useful. Hopefully you've got a little bit more familiarity with what a URL is. Specifically, what you want to do is you want to focus on the parts of the URL: the protocol, the domain, the port, the path, the query string, and the fragment, and be able to identify them if you are given a URL. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and thank you for watching.